Hello, Megan. How are you doing?
I'm well, and yourself?
I'm okay, although unusually I'm using the phone this time. I normally actually have my headset, but my office at the end of the semester is in such a state of disrepair that I can't actually find my headset.
Technology fail. And I actually dug out. I'm using my phone. Normally I use Skype, but my headset has taken off for parts unknown. And I don't even have the end of semester excuse, so we'll both have to look a little odd today.
Yes, and I apologize if my voice cracks a little bit, kind of like Bobby Brady and the Brady Bunch, but I'm getting over a cold, and it
going
did not
through puberty?
Help. No, but I can feel my laryngitis starting to potentially kick in. I exacerbated things. Last night I was at the Foreign Policy Top 100 Global Thinkers event, of which, let me add, it was a tragedy, Megan, that you were not at this event.
I was not invited. I'm not a top global thinker, as I think we all know.
They invited a lot of, it was not just the top 100 global thinkers, but you would appreciate this. At one point I was in a situation where I was asked to interview people sort of rapid fire for Foreign Policy TV, and so in the span of 30 minutes, I believe I interviewed Amy Chua, Robert Kaplan, and Saskia Sassen.
My word.
Yeah, so I'll just apologize here and now for the atrocious job I'm sure I did during that period.
I just want to know if you managed to tie all of that together into one package, like a coherent... What was the theme there?
Well, no, they were discrete little 10-minute packages, so, fortunately it wasn't like a talk show, although that really is, now that I think about it, something that would be kind of fun if you could sort of do the David Letterman or Jimmy Fallon style talk show where, only on foreign policy, but I could have like a sidekick making snarky remarks.
And of course it would be a huge hit because God knows what the kids these days are paying attention to is foreign policy.
That's not a bad idea. I could get zombie David Brinkley to be my sidekick. Maybe that could be better.
And then maybe I could do one in economics because God knows if there's anything the kids love more than foreign policy, it's economics.
Well, speaking of economics, Megan.
Yes, and foreign policy.
And foreign policy. So, we are now in day 535 of the Eurozone crisis, subtitle, How Can It Get Any Worse? I will let you sort of set up the state of play, and we can potentially project whether or not there is a way out of the current unbelievable, unmitigated fiasco.
Well, I think the state of play is if you've ever watched Friends go through a tragic and terrible divorce, you will recognize many of the trends going on in Europe today. Basically, at this point, Germany, kind of understandably, doesn't really want to lash its credit rating to that of Italy and Greece. Greece and Italy, kind of understandably, don't feel like they should pay, given that they are poorer than the Germans, don't really feel like they should undertake drastic budget cuts in order to bail out German banks. And the ECB, playing the role of your beleaguered best friend, is saying, I can help fix this, but first you have to help me help you. In other words, they are saying, we would be more than happy to open up the liquidity taps, but first we would like to see that Italy and Greece are capable of getting their budgets just kind of semi-under control. There have been a series of kind of half-hearted plans that have all failed. And I think that the only good news that I really see out of Europe right now is that we're now beyond the stage of half-hearted plans that aren't going to work. We're now
at the stage of full-throated plans that will not work.
I guess I should ask, are you a skeptic, or what do you think?
Well, you go ahead, and then I'll give my take. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of the plans as they're being proposed, but I want to hear your take first.
I mean, I basically think at this point, Europe has a lot of strikes against it, and I think we both agree it's not an optimal currency zone. Everyone agrees it's not an optimal currency zone. On the other hand, Missouri and Michigan are not exactly an optimal currency zone either, but the U.S. deals with this by having people move. And indeed, East Germany and West Germany, when they merged, dealt with the fact that the currency was really too expensive for East German productivity. A lot of East Germans just picked up and moved to West Germany. It's not really an option for Europe. You talk about deeper fiscal integration, and as Austin Goolsbee has pointed out, that's really not enough unless you want to create these kind of peripheral ghettos where the Greeks and the Italians either have to take radical wage cuts and radical cuts in their standard of living, or they just sort of exist on sort of semi-permanent subsidies or semi-permanent non-subsidies and just kind of misery, while Germany enjoys a highly valued currency, or Germany undergoes deflation and kind of moves over towards the sort of slides down towards the Mediterranean state, which is also not really acceptable to their people. And so you've got this really fundamental tension that there is no plan that's going to fix, right? You can maybe hold the Eurozone together, but you can't fix that tension. And that tension, I think, ultimately rips the Eurozone apart. Maybe it doesn't now. Maybe we survive another 3 years. But the fact is, you're always going to have this credibility problem. And I think investors have to think about this now. Okay, we saved the Eurozone. We put in these budget constraints, which is the current plan on the table is, look, you're going to set up some mechanism where Germany kind of basically does a bailout that's going to cost Germany something like 5% of their GDP. The ECB steps in and turns on the liquidity taps. And in exchange, Italy and Greece undertake this austerity
in exchange,
program.
As near as I can figure, the trade-off that's being proposed right now is essentially, massive monetary expansion, that the ECB will open up the taps, provided that the rest of, that Southern Europe essentially adopts the German fiscal model.
Right.
Or actually, and to be clear, the German fiscal model that the Germans claim they do, as opposed to, let's say, what the Germans occasionally actually do, which is violate their own growth and stability pact agreements, which they did back in 2005. But the notion is that if the rest of the, I think Merkel is, I will, trash her in a number of different ways, but actually the one message that she's been consistent on, relatively speaking, is that she's perfectly happy to push towards greater fiscal union and greater European integration so long as the rest of Europe looks more like Germany.
But I don't think that that's really practical. I mean, the Greeks can't wake up and say,
right,
I have decided today I'm going to be more like Germany. I mean, we've all done this, right? Like, you have this friend who runs 10 miles every morning and is super fit and never eats anything except salmon and kale. And, you'll have this fit of saying, on New Year's, I am going to be like that. And it lasts like a day, because I'm fundamentally not like that person in many, many, many ways. And that's a little frivolous, but I actually think that this is a kind of deeply true thing, that institutions are really hard to build, and you don't just wake up and declare that they exist. And no one that I'm aware of has had success with that.
Okay, I will say two things in response. First, now I have another brilliant idea, which is Sex and the City style pilot to explain global political economy. So I think you've just developed an episode on its own. So, we're going to have to pitch this to someone. But the second thing is, I completely agree with you on the point of, well, actually, I have two additional points. The first is that the notion that Greece or Italy or Spain can snap their fingers and suddenly become much more like the sort of German economic model is, I agree, completely absurd, because it kind of is of a piece of, with a lot of analysts saying only politics is getting in the way of, solving the euro crisis, which implies that somehow that makes it easier. But in fact...
Or that, that's not... It's at some level, sovereign debt crisis is a political crisis, right? Why do we have sovereign debt crises? We are worried that they will not pay. And that's always a political decision. Yeah. Unless they're actually, physically out of paper. It's always a political decision to not pay creditors and give stuff to their citizens instead. So this is not a useful criticism.
There's actually a deeper issue here, and this is the part that I honestly can't understand, which is, let's assume for the moment that you could actually snap your fingers and, in fact, Italy, Spain, Greece, all of these countries would, in fact, be perfectly willing to adopt the German model. This would actually be one of the worst things for Germany in the long term. Because one of the dirty secrets about the Eurozone is that the reason that Germany has done well in the Eurozone is because it allowed the countries in Southern Europe to increase their consumption, to borrow. And what were they buying? They were buying German exports.
Right.
And so as a result, Germany was actually able to have, for the last decade, the best of both worlds. They had a euro that was probably not quite as strong as they would have liked, but still relatively strong. And they actually managed to boost their exports because they were able to export to Southern Europe. If, in fact, Southern Europe were to adopt these kinds of policies, they would obviously, create austerity, and what they would stop doing is stop buying German goods. So the part that I'm honestly flummoxed about is, assuming this actually were to work, Germany actually might in the end suffer more than, a sort of breakup scenario right now.
Well, I think at this point, though, that's over. it kind of doesn't matter what they do, right? They bail out these guys and make them act more like Germany, which is to say not borrow money and spend it on consumer goods from Germany.
Yeah.
Because the Germans don't buy consumer goods from Germany. That's everyone else. Or they exit the Eurozone, in which case they have a currency crisis and they can't afford to buy consumer goods from Germany. So I think Germany has to just ask, like, given that ride is over, and I agree with you, they've been great beneficiaries of it, what do we do? Yeah. And, I can't quite blame them for saying, I'm not sure this is going to work. I mean, the thing that's actually driven me mad, along with the political thing, saying this is all the risks are political, which is to me like saying, well, if this plan would work, if it would only work. I mean, right. Great. It's just a political problem.
No, it's like that old Simpsons episode. There's no simple trick here. It's just a simple trick.
Exactly. But the other thing that has driven me crazy is the people who keep saying, like, we know what will work if they would just do it, and this is complete twaddle. I think it will work. I mean, I agree with them basically that I think that if the ECB turns on the spigot, that this will solve many of the problems. I think that if they really get serious and issue a Eurobond, this will work. But I can also see scenarios where it doesn't work. I can see scenarios where you've then just made the ultimate collapse that much more horrific and expensive, right? Because there may just come a time. And again, as these economies, assuming they're not going to be like Germany, end up with low productivity, excessively high wages, which means high unemployment, low GDP growth, and all of the things that come along with having an overvalued currency. You can say Germany has, which is what the proposal is, as I understand it, is that in some sense Germany, France, the central countries will have the right to step in and run your budget if you can't. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Germans are going to be able to collect taxes when the Greek government can't? Really? And more to the point, when they
the Germans
do this,
could even send, uniformed officers down to Greece to collect those taxes. I'm sure that wouldn't generate any resentment whatsoever.
Exactly. That's a really good idea. I don't know why the Germans haven't thought of that before. And then, or, even if you sort of pressure them into doing this, there may just come a point where the population says, no, we're out. And then Germany has written these guarantees.
Yeah.
And they don't have the budget power because finally you've pushed Italy and Greece or whoever it is. It could be Portugal. It could be... Right? There's no way to finesse the fact that these are sovereign nations that have the right to withdraw from the EU if it becomes so painful that it's intolerable. And part of what the proposal is to fix the Eurozone, to me, carries a high risk of making it so painful that it will be intolerable.
But you can argue, Megan, that's part of the problem, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, there is actually no, provision in the Treaty of the European Union or any of the Eurozone agreements that actually allows countries to exit. That's the problem.
You can exit this is actually, so I actually, in one of my other gin metaphors, of which I'm very fond with the euro, I think it works on many levels, but I would talk to people in like 2003, 2004, about the euro, and I would say, this is not an optimal currency zone. Doesn't this seem dangerous to you? And they would say, yes, it's not an optimal currency zone. And I would say, but you don't have any of these, you're not fiscally integrated, you don't have labor mobility. And they were like, yes, that's the point. It's going to make us do that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's like joining the most expensive gym in town on the grounds that now you're really, really going to have to go, right?
Right, yeah.
It works if it works. Unfortunately, it didn't.
Again, you're really coming up with these Sex in the City. I'm really liking this project here, Megan.
Yes, I really think we can do foreign policy in the city. And so, like, there was this idea that you could somehow force yourself to integrate and force Italy and Greece to be more like Germany, right? And then the problem was, as you point out, that Germany was, as I recall, either France or Germany was the first country to breach the Maastricht criteria. And then they actually tried a move where they were like, right, so Italy, we can do this, but you can't because you're Italy and we're not. And Italy was like, that's really funny. And then no one paid attention to the Maastricht criteria. So I just, there is, so anyway, to go back to this, they set it up with no exit mechanism for the euro. But you can exit the EU. And if there's a point at which your GDP has been shrinking for 4 years and, your Germany has just come in and cut your pensions, I feel like that might be the point at which you say this EU thing's been great and all, but I'm gonna see how life is on the outside.
That's that is a disturbing possibility. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you've necessarily just said about the problems regarding the Eurozone. One of the things I do wonder, I mean, even if I'm having a hard time picturing how this ends without a complete disorganized breakdown. I mean, in some ways, the situation now, the scariest thing about it is that it reminds me roughly of the situation in sort of the global economy in about 1933, when you had a series of bank crises and there was a recognition that the gold standard as it was functioning wasn't working terribly well. Some countries had gone off, some countries were still on. There was that 1933 London conference that was designed to sort of resurrect the system. And in the end, it doesn't work because Roosevelt comes to power, immediately takes the U.S. off the gold standard unilaterally, and, chaos prevails. And the irony was that by 36, everyone was pursuing roughly the same kind of monetary policies they should have been pursuing, which was they were allowing for some reflation, they were avoiding deflation. But the process by which they got there was so unbelievably chaotic that it actually worsened the problem, you can argue. And so my concern is that even if you have even if you can, I can accept the notion, look, the euro is not an optimal currency area. It would be best if Greece at a minimum, possibly, Portugal or other countries were to exit the euro. The problem is that how that happens is just as important as whether or not if that happens. And I don't see how this can happen in an orderly manner.
So I would say two things to that. I mean, the first is I obviously completely agree with you. And I think that one of the big problems is that the minute that people think that the Eurozone has that leaders are preparing for the breakup of the Eurozone, markets will make it so that they have to break up, right? All debt will start going wild 6 ways from Sunday. And at that point...
Although really, I mean, does that look that much different from the way it is now? I mean, if Italy and Spain are borrowing, or I mean, Italy is still trying to get 7% borrowing rates. Right. Spain's over 5 or 6%, and Germany last week could not, sell its bonds. That's pretty friggin' serious. I mean, can it get more serious?
Yeah, I mean, I saw people fist pumping because Italy had managed to sell some 2-year debt at I think 6 3/4, which is great credit card rates. So I wonder if MasterCard will let them. They get a lot of air miles. That might solve the problem. You get a lot of air miles, and then you fly everyone in Italy to America. And we need them in DC. They could bring us good food. So I think that's a big problem, is that no one's preparing, because to be seen to prepare is to seal the fate, right? So if it happens, it's going to happen in the most disorderly possible, disastrous way. So I think that there is an argument, a good argument, that at this point it's less expensive for everyone involved to keep the Eurozone going, at least in the short term. It's certainly better for the United States if they keep it going. But I think the problem is that it's gone on a year ago. All of this stuff, had they done it, obviously it would have solved the problem. I mean, it just would have quieted markets. It's gone on for so long now. I'm not sure that there's actually a credible response. I'm not sure there's anything that will work. I mean, I think it's quite conceivable that there's just no plausible intervention that is going to convince markets that this is for more than a couple of years. Because if it's for more than a couple of years, then their debt just goes all over the place, and it happens anyway. And the fact is that these guys don't like each other that much. They don't feel identified with each other. And when that happened with us, it took a civil war to settle matters. And so yes, we got closer union, but it took a long and bloody 100 years to get there. It's not
500,000 dead.
Yeah, just a small cost.
Right. Well, hopefully it will not come to that. Otherwise, Marty Feldstein, very famously wrote an article in Foreign Affairs about 13 or 14 years ago, predicting that, in fact, the euro would lead to actual conflict in Europe.
I don't remember this one.
What? Yeah, and this was an article that was pretty widely mocked at the time, and you can argue still might be deserving of mockery. Except now suddenly that the likelihood that article turns out to be correct, I've upgraded from about 0.001% to, let's say, 5% at this point. So that's really disturbing. But, Megan, I have to say I've hesitated very much from trying to interrupt you during this conversation. I'm very, wary about doing this, and you are going to explain why I've been so wary.
Yes, I wrote a piece yesterday, basically talking about why women don't negotiate in salary when they, especially when they're starting a new job. So research shows that part of the reason that women make on average less money than men. There's a lot of reasons, and actually childbearing is like at the top of the list.
Right.
And the number of hours worked are actually the top two factors that cause women to make less than men. But even so, when you look at women who are doing the same job and don't have children, etc., they do make slightly less than men. And the reason that they make less than men is that they don't negotiate. And so the standard answer to that has long been, well, negotiate, lady. But in fact, there are reasons that women don't negotiate, and women are seen differently doing the same things. And when I was in business school, and I'm hashing the details because I tried to look up this case, it was 10 years ago, and I don't remember it well enough to kind of track down. But I learned about this case where they basically they split it, and half of the students read about John doing leading a team in a tough situation, and half the students read about Jane, and that was the only thing they changed. It just changed the names. And fascinatingly, John was like a take-charge leader who was doing, what was necessary for the good of his team, and Jane, unfortunately, was a hysterical bitch who had just wildly overstepped her authority and was just making a mess of things by ordering everyone around left and right. And that is a dynamic that women think about. So what I wrote about was that, when I will go to group interviews or I'll sit in meetings, guys will start talking. And there's always in meetings, right, when two people, especially in a group interview, where everyone is trying to get as many questions to this person that you're interviewing in in the period of time, there's always a contested verbal space. And the guy will start talking and I'll start talking and I always stop. And I don't think that they know that it happens. I don't think they're thinking, if I keep talking, this woman's going to back off. But I also think that it would be actually unwise for me to keep talking, because then I'm already pretty opinionated and I like to talk a lot. So I don't really want to push further.
Megan, you? What? It's like you're describing another person.
It's like you never even really knew me, isn't it, Dan? But so, and so the natural inference might be that, well, I'm really pushy and I just resent having been. But it's actually the opposite, which is that if I'm doing this, then imagine what other women are doing. And in fact, women give up these contested verbal spaces. They back down. They do not do things that are seen as aggressive for very good reason. They'll be punished for being seen as aggressive. They will, it then becomes more difficult to work with your team members. People won't like you as much. You don't want to get a reputation for being an aggressive bitch. It's really harmful. I've seen it in companies that I've worked with. The aggressive bitches do not get promoted, and they're seen as being bad for clients and all sorts of things. And in some sense, it's right. The clients don't like it either. And so women are always conscious of this, and men aren't. They don't know what's. In my experience is men are just genuinely don't know what's happening. They're really surprised when you mention that this happens, in the same way that they're really surprised when you talk about getting catcalled. Because most guys have never seen it happen, unless you do it.
Have you ever seen what happens?
Most guys have never seen a female friend of theirs catcalled.
Oh.
Because it only happens when we're alone, and so when you would describe how frequent this was, they would be really surprised. They'd never seen it. And this is similar. You just don't notice. And I'm sure there's in the same way that I had a friend who was black, who worked with me, and she described being followed around stores by salespeople. And I'm sure that had happened in stores I was in, right? Mm-hmm. But I'd never seen it happen.
I'm going to interrupt here and say that you're wrong, actually, because I do know this. But the reason I know it is as a professor, which is to say the same thing you're talking about in terms of sort of a business environment, in my experience, also happens in a seminar environment in a university. So if I'm having a discussion seminar, and it's the same thing where I'll ask a question, and that's a moment where it's a contested verbal space. I would say this is a probabilistic thing because God knows I do see women perfectly willing to plow ahead. But by and large, if a woman and a man start talking at the same time, it is generally speaking the guy that will continue to talk, and the woman will stop doing it. So in fact, I've seen the exact same thing you're talking about, but more as a professor.
But you're also an enlightened and unusually enlightened and perspicacious person. So.
Well, the other thing is that, the really aggressive bitches, I downgrade. I mean, they're only going to get C's. I mean, no, I'm sorry. I don't think that's. I obviously don't do that, but I apologize for the joke. But the interesting thing is that I'm not. I will say I've seen a slight. If I were going to think about this, I think I've seen a slight trend over time in which I've seen women, at least in the classroom, being more willing to be aggressive in terms of having their viewpoint made, and also less resentment by the other students from that. So I do wonder if this is sort of a. I mean, this might be the naive hope here, but I do wonder if this is sort of a generational effect over time of as you get adjusted to the concept of, let's say, women adopting more positions of authority or more interrogatory positions, what have you. It sort of trickles down into everyday workplace and everyday classroom.
Well, I would say from your lips to God's ears, I certainly hope that that's correct. And I don't think that given the reporting that I do, they're not a lot of 20-something women in those interviews.
Well, that in and of itself is a problem.
Well, I mean, it's partly because we're all elderly. But also, I mean, the interesting thing is economics journalism used to be really male identified, and there's a lot of young women going into it, which is excellent and exciting. But when I started doing it, there was not. It was I think me and Gertrude Morgenstern and a couple other people, but not a great deal. And now there's a lot of people like Annie Lowry and oh God, why are names? There's two others who I was thinking of who are excellent young female journalists. But since I'm elderly, unfortunately. Yes, and unfortunately...
Catherine Rampell, or,
unfortunately, I'm elderly, so things drop out of my head with, sadly, ever-increasing frequency. No, but they're great women...
Ditz, Megan!
There are great women, young journalists out there, which is... but there aren't a lot at the interviews I go to. It tends to be a lot of guys. So yeah, that's great to hear that it's hopeful. I don't really have... I mean, the funny thing is, I don't know what you do about that, aside from saying, guys, maybe notice that this is happening.
I have to admit, I tend... It's one of those things where I don't necessarily, intervene. Actually, to be honest, what it really depends on over time in the classroom is whether or not the people are actually saying smart things or not. There's a way in which if someone has, let's say either verbal diarrhea or they're not making necessarily all that much of a contribution to class, then over time what I might do if they interrupt at the same time someone else interrupts, I will favor the other person very often. But it's one of those things where it's that said, I'm not sure I've intervened enough. Because as you say, it's something that I've noticed, but it wasn't something I've necessarily acted on.
Well, and the problem too is that if you intervene too much, right, you then end up with people resenting that you're being too nice to the girl. It's very flat.
And that's not that. Yeah, there are a host of problems with that. So I actually do try not to do that all that much. But it's. I think the other thing that's actually changed a little bit is that at least Fletcher is in that sense not different from a lot of professional schools now, which is you've got majority women in the classroom.
There were my class was 80% male when I was in business school. So,
but I mean, this has changed dramatically over the last decade or two. Where in top, I mean, I think Fletcher at this point, I want to say is 55% women. I mean, I believe the data suggests this is not just my program, but this is more generally a lot of professional programs, law, medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if it's the same with business, but I would have to imagine the numbers.
It's not in business. It's gone up. The numbers have gone up a lot, but they're not at parity. I presume that's where all the men. I mean, you kind of. There's a whole separate discussion, right, about what the hell are men doing? They're not going to grad school. They're not. What are they doing rather than getting an education, which is kind of disturbing. But speaking of...
I assume they're gaming, frankly. But
well, Skyrim is apparently great. My husband has been locked in his office for the last 2 weeks every night playing it. So
I have to admit, this might explain my productivity. I constantly get asked, and this is a humble brag, Dan, how do you write so much, or how do you blog so much? And I think my two answers at this point is that A, I don't do any kind of gaming, online gaming whatsoever, and B, I have no interest whatsoever in college sports.
Wow, yeah, those are your two major time sucks. Yeah, when people ask me
Yeah.
how I'm so awesome, I say, well, my husband plays a lot of video games, which obviously leaves me a great deal of time for self-improvement. No, my husband is lovely, and we spend as much time together as work permits. But
I think your husband is lovely too. But
speaking of people who need an intervention, sorry, I had to, even though I'm being a pushy, aggressive bitch, I had to get in with that awesome transition. The GOP and foreign policy, and you're gonna have to take the lead on this one because I frankly, it's like a train wreck. I can't look. It's too painful.
Unfortunately, I did look, and I wrote a very long essay in the British Spectator describing the disaster that is sort of GOP thinking on foreign policy. Which is to say, first of all, when the presidential candidates, they haven't really tried to talk about it all that much. The only time they have sort of talked about it was in the two foreign policy debates, after which you kind of wish they had not talked about it, a lot of it. I mean, the odd thing is that, to be fair, there are issues. This is how scary the state of the GOP foreign policy debate is. There are multiple issues, particularly on Pakistan, where the sanest people talking are Rick Santorum and Michelle Bachmann.
Ooh. And what?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's actually the current situation.
It's worse than I thought.
Yeah. But to be fair, and then of course they sound crazy on other issues. And there's a whole variety of reasons for this. I think the disturbing thing is that politically, most of the GOP has very little incentive to talk all that much about foreign policy. First of all, that's not what voters care about, to be fair. At least particularly not GOP voters right now. I mean, you want to talk about the economy, you don't want to talk about foreign policy. Second, it's, comparatively speaking, Obama's strength in going into the general election. Today's job report notwithstanding. There's generally a great deal of dissatisfaction with Obama on the economy. On the other hand, his favorability ratings on foreign policy have, gone up with the death of bin Laden, the way the Libya conflict has ended, and most recently his East Asia swing. So on the whole, he's done pretty well in that area. It's just, as someone who cares about foreign policy, it's very depressing to see this kind of state of the debate. And the other thing now, and this is not just foreign policy, but more generally the state of the GOP race, is that it really is taking on reality show type qualities that are just profoundly disturbing. It's this thing where you have these bubbles of candidates who sort of pop up to the top and then, self-destruct, like Bachmann or like Perry, or now like Herman Cain. And the latest little bit is that apparently Newsmax is going to be hosting a debate in Des Moines on December 27th, and it will be moderated, apparently, according to the New York Times, by Donald Trump.
No, make it stop.
Yes, the Donald will in fact be hosting the debate. Now, if
if he's going to say you're fired and actually push people out of the race, I might be able to go along with that.
Well, I'd be more interested if they could get Melissa and Joan Rivers to also do.
Do the fashion.
Yeah, I would want Joan Rivers to ask questions. Joan Rivers would bust some.
She would be good, yeah.
Talk about an aggressive bitch. I mean, she would be
self-identified. I think.
Yes, exactly. She would. I have no doubt that she would take charge. I mean, I've been as disgusted as I have been with the sort of state of the debate, and I think I had a dialogue with Heather Hurlburt in which I unleashed a whole series of F-bombs in terms of my assessment of the campaign. I do wonder if this is one of those things that 6 months from now we'll look back, and it looks bad, but it won't look that bad, because whoever winds up being the nominee is presumably going to be not Perry, not Bachmann, not Cain, but someone with at least you could plausibly see, taking the oath of office.
Well, I mean, I'm actually kind of interested in the Newt wave right now. In part because since he, and maybe I'm just reading snippets out of context, but since he got nominated, he's increasingly sounding like your crazy paranoid aunt who decides that, she's going to, take over the mayoral office and start making everyone in the city wear pink on Wednesdays. Completely crazy proclamations about himself and his awesomeness. You kind of wonder, you really got to the age of 50 all by yourself without a minder or anything? Where he, claimed that he, I guess it is exciting that we're going to have the guy who brought down the Soviet Union nearly single-handedly. And You gotta chalk that up. I mean, do you remember when he got up there and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall"?
I always thought it was Reagan who did that.
I tear up every time I think of and when he told us it was morning in America. These are moments that, like, I think we do have to think about seriously when we think about whether we're going to elect Newt Gingrich to run our foreign policy. Who else would have had the courage? I have to say,
if Newt Gingrich were to get the nomination, the general election of Barack Obama versus Newt Gingrich might have the greatest gap between how smart these people actually are versus how smart they think they are.
Wait, are you saying that Newt thinks he's smarter than Barack Obama, or that they
I think
think
Newt
that they're
thinks
smarter?
Look, I will say in defense, I think they're both actually reasonably intelligent guys. But I think both of them have a much higher opinion of themselves than they actually are, I guess would be the way to put it.
It's sort of weird, actually, the Obama, like the legend of Barack Obama, the incredible professor. Like, he's like an adjunct professor who, as far as I know, hasn't really published much. Am I wrong about that?
No, yeah, I think he always held a visiting or adjunct position in Chicago when I was there, at least. He was very well liked, and he was pretty well respected.
No, I'm not. But like the idea, people keep talking about him as like a constitutional scholar,
right?
Which I don't think is an accurate. I am also not a constitutional scholar. I don't think this is a criticism of him, but like there's this kind of weird legend of Barack Obama, and at times I do wonder when I read stuff about his administration whether Barack Obama himself did not start reading some of these articles about Barack Obama, constitutional scholar, and general academic lodestar for America.
I can tell you that this actually, you can argue, probably had an effect on the way the administration was run the first year or so, because I've talked to a fair number of people who all basically said that there were instances where everyone thought Obama was the smartest guy in the room, and therefore there were decisions that probably should have been made at the lower level, but that were decided to be kicked up to his level because the thought was, well, he's the smartest guy in the room, let him make the decision. He probably didn't discourage that kind of thinking. Except, to be fair, in no small part because he thought this made him a distinct contrast with George W. Bush. But there is a reason why you have a hierarchy in organizations, and that's so that you don't have to, if you're at the top, make all of the decisions.
Well, and given the caliber of his economic advisors, that seems like, frankly, insane to me. I mean, like, I'm sure Barack Obama is a very smart guy, but I do not think he's smarter than Larry Summers and Austin Goolsbee and Christina Summers and like Christina Rowe. I think that's crazy. That you would decide to take stuff past them to a very smart. I mean, I like not dissing his intelligence, but I mean the guy's not an economist, and he certainly didn't have anywhere near the kind of knowledge or experience that. So that's actually fairly disturbing.
This gets to this point about what are the prerequisites to be a president, and on the one hand, there is a base level of intelligence, and not just intelligence, but actual factual knowledge. I mean, one of I think the biggest absurdities, for example, of Herman Cain's logic on foreign policy is that I will give him some credit because he was really persistent in saying, I don't need to know that much about foreign policy. All I need to do is get the best intelligence I can, and then I'll make my decision. But that presumes that you know enough to actually be able to, correctly process that information.
Right.
So I think there is a sort of necessary level of intelligence, but it's clearly not just intelligence in terms of the presidency, because you can argue that the two smartest presidents we've had in our history in terms of just sort of, either education and or, intelligence were Jimmy Carter and Woodrow Wilson. And these didn't end well.
Yeah, Woodrow Wilson, worst president in U.S. history, and I do include Nixon. And the flip side of that is, of course, that I've heard stories with the Bush administration about. I wrote about one of these stories about the Farm Bill, where everyone knew that the Farm Bill was crap policy, but they were doing it in order to get Trade Promotion Authority passed, and basically they wanted they needed certain legal authority to go to Doha and negotiate a new round of WTO talks. So they did the steel tariffs in the Farm Bill that was a payoff to the protectionist interests.
Right. Yeah.
So, like, after he'd signed it, they're in a meeting and someone cracks a joke about how crappy the Farm Bill was. So you're like, well, let's hope it's not their Farm Bill, about some other policy. And he's like, wait a minute, what's wrong with the Farm Bill? You guys told me this was a good bill. And, like, everyone just kind of assumed he understood. It wasn't that they were trying to hide the football. I mean, people have accused Larry Summers of actively trying to hide the football from Obama, and Austin Goolsbee frequently got in trouble for kind of taking the football out from behind Larry Summers and be like, it's here! But in this case, they just... Of course, everyone knows farm subsidies suck. They're terrible economic policy, right? So they just never occurred it to anyone to tell Bush, but of course he wasn't an economist. And he hadn't been thinking about, he hadn't been marinated in this instinctively everyone knows farm bills are terrible.
Right, and well, I mean, the standard criticism of Bush was always that he wasn't intelligent, which I never found, that wasn't the case. But Bush's greatest flaw, without question, was that he was genuinely uncurious. And so he would never ask questions. And you can argue that potentially Obama does have that ability, but again, there are, it's this interesting question of what are the right appropriate, mix of qualities you want in a president. And the only thing I'm pretty sure of is that Newt Gingrich probably doesn't quite have that exact mix. But that's a whole separate issue.
Yeah. I mean, do you have a favorite among the seven dwarfs? Or dwarfs?
I would love it if John Huntsman were to actually do well, but I don't assume that's not going to happen.
Yes, I'm also a Huntsman fan, although I thought his economic plan was silly. But silly in the way that these things just inevitably are, not silly in a deep and profoundly unusual way. But of the people,
if it's between the Romney versus not Romney camp, I mean, my personal preference would be for someone like Romney to get nominated, because I'm assuming that whoever the GOP puts forward is going to have a really, really, really excellent chance of becoming president, based on the sort of fundamentals. So I'd like that person to, be semi-competent.
Yeah, I have to say, I really disliked Romney. I certainly excruciatingly disliked the way he strapped his dog to the top of his station wagon to drive it somewhere. That's just, like, the kind of, callousness is shocking. On the other hand, I wrote a profile of him a couple of months ago, and I came out of it more impressed than I had started. His books are, standard autobiography. They do actually reveal a sort of solid way of thinking about business, and thinking about, and not just business, because I think that mythos of, like, the private sector is awesome.
No, that's horrible. That's the Herman Cain philosophy of I know how to run a business, therefore I know how to run government. And there's been that streak in the U.S. polity going back to Ross Perot or Wendell Willkie, but it never actually plays out there. And for that matter, George W. Bush, but it never works terribly well.
Well, no, right, because running a business is very much not like running something where you have 535 people who have to vote yes to anything
exactly.
And where you have this enormous staff that's larger than any other business in the world.
Right.
But just the way he thought about management problems, actually, I came away impressed. And the other interesting thing is that when you talk to people who've known him, like, there's been no leaks of here is Mitt Romney's terrible personal whatever. No one has come out with anything like that. And there's two interpretations of that. And the first is that he is so terrible that people are terrified of him. Maybe. It's possible, right? But the other interpretation is that, in fact, he's just a super nice guy, and people really do just like him that much that no one wants to say anything mean about him.
I have to say, so far, my favorite Saturday Night Live bit of the campaign so far was the Mitt Romney Raw and Uncut or something, in which, it was like, Mitt Romney, it was just this absurd thing of I'm not going to read the magazine or something.
Mitt Romney, double parks, when he's waiting for the light.
Yes. So in that sense, it's good. All right. Megan, I just heard the door close, which means my children are about to arrive, and they're not going to be aware that I'm doing the blogging hit. So I think we're going to have to wrap this up, unfortunately.
Well, it has been a joy, as always.
As always, I hope you have a good weekend.
Yes.
And let's hope the world financial system doesn't collapse next week.
Well, I'm going to be running around with sticking tape and chewing gum and patching whatever holes I can, and hopefully that'll be enough.
Excellent. Good luck. Take
Bye,
care.
Internet.
Bye.
And then maybe I could do one on economics, because God knows if there's anything the kids love more than foreign policy, it's economics.
Well, speaking of economics, Megan.
Yes, and foreign policy.
And foreign policy. So, we are now in day 535 of the Eurozone crisis, subtitle, How Can It Get Any Worse? So, I will let you sort of set up the state of play, and we can potentially project whether or not there is a way out of the current unbelievable, unmitigated fiasco.
Well, I think the state of play is if you've ever watched friends go through a tragic and terrible divorce, you will recognize many of the trends going on in Europe today. Basically, at this point, Germany, kind of understandably, doesn't really want to lash its credit rating to that of Italy and Greece. Greece and Italy, kind of understandably, don't feel like they should pay, given that they're poor.
It was not just the top 100 global thinkers, but you would appreciate this. At one point I was in a situation where I was asked to interview people sort of rapid fire for Foreign Policy TV, and so in the span of 30 minutes, I believe I interviewed Amy Chua, Robert Kaplan, and Saskia Sassen.
My word.
Yeah, so I'll just apologize here and now for the atrocious job I'm sure I did during that period.
I just want to know if you managed to tie all of that together into one package, like a coherent... What was the theme there?
Well, no, they were discrete little 10-minute packages, so, fortunately it wasn't like a talk show, although that really is, now that I think about it, something that would be kind of fun if you could sort of do the David Letterman or Jimmy Fallon style talk show where, only on foreign policy, but I could have like a sidekick making snarky remarks.
And of course it would be a huge hit because God knows what the kids these days are paying attention to is foreign policy.
That's not a bad idea. I could get zombie David Brinkley to be my sidekick. Hello, Megan. How are you doing?
I'm well, and yourself?
I'm okay, although unusually I'm using the phone this time. I normally actually have my headset, but my office at the end of the semester is in such a state of disrepair that I can't actually find my headset.
Technology fail. And I actually dug out. I'm using my phone. Normally I use Skype, but my headset has taken off for parts unknown. And I don't even have the end of semester excuse, so we'll both have to look a little odd today.
Yes, and I apologize if my voice cracks a little bit, kind of like Bobby Brady and the Brady Bunch, but I'm getting over a cold, and it did not help. No, but I can feel my laryngitis starting to potentially kick in. I exacerbated things. Last night I was at the Foreign Policy Top 100 Global Thinkers event, of which, let me add, it was a tragedy, Megan, that you were not at this event.
I was not invited. I'm not a top global thinker, as I think we all know.
They invited a lot of... I want to hear your take first.
I mean, I basically think at this point, there's a lot of... Europe has a lot of strikes against it. And I think we both agree it's not an optimal currency zone. Everyone agrees it's not an optimal currency zone. On the other hand, Missouri and Michigan are not exactly an optimal currency zone either. But the U.S. deals with this by having people move. And indeed, East Germany and West Germany, when they merged, dealt with the fact that the currency was really too expensive for East German productivity. A lot of East Germans just picked up and moved to West Germany. It's not really an option for Europe. You talk about deeper fiscal integration, and as Austin Goolsbee has pointed out, that's really not enough unless you want to create these kind of peripheral ghettos where the Greeks and the Italians either have to take radical wage cuts and radical cuts in their standard of living, or they just sort of exist on sort of semi-permanent subsidies or semi-permanent non-subsidies and just kind of misery, while Germany enjoys a highly valued career. Than the Germans don't really feel like they should undertake drastic budget cuts in order to bail out German banks. And the ECB, playing the role of your beleaguered best friend, is saying, I can help fix this, but first you have to help me help you. In other words, they are saying, we would be more than happy to open up the liquidity taps, but first we would like to see that Italy and Greece are capable of getting their budgets just kind of semi-under control. There have been a series of kind of half-hearted plans that have all failed. And I think that the only good news that I really see out of Europe right now is that we're now beyond the stage of half-hearted plans that aren't going to work. We're now at
the stage of full-throated plans that will not work.
I guess I should ask, are you a skeptic, or what do you think?
Well, you go ahead, and then I'll give my take. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of the plans as they're being proposed, but